Welcome to the 463rd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today is a discussion of disinformation in the pandemic with returning COVID calls guest Kate STARBIRD. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live on Twitter and on the COVID Calls YouTube channel, and you can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. As always, feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of March 10th, 2022, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, 965,225 people in the United States have died from COVID-19. In South Korea, 9,646 have died. 1,252 of those deaths from COVID-19 in South Korea have come this week. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that now. The headline is Sharon Jodak King, advocate for people with disabilities in Washington and beyond, dies at 81. It was published February 10th, 2022, written by Paige Cornwell, appeared in the Seattle Times. Sharon Jodak King wanted to fly. Jodak King, who was born with cerebral palsy and used a wheelchair and communication devices, traveled to several states, including Alaska. For her 80th birthday, she planned to go ziplining, but pandemic restrictions got in the way. One of her poems, titled I Would Fly, begins, "Oh, if I could fly, I would fly. Oh yes, I would fly the edges of a cliff, looking over a deep crevasse with no bottom." Sharon Marie Jodak King, an artist, educator, and longtime advocate for people with disabilities in Seattle and beyond, died January 27, 2022, at her Shoreline home. She was 81. She died from melanoma and complications from COVID-19, according to her sister, Norma Christensen of Ferndale. From birth, her life was one of overcoming extraordinary circumstances. Doctors told her parents she would be lucky to live to 35. Nuns at St. Joseph's Orthopedic Ward in Bellingham, where she lived during the week for most of her childhood, taught her to use a typewriter, though her formal schooling ended in 6th grade because there weren't education services in the area for students with special needs. At age 20, she moved to Rainier School in Buckley, which specialized in teaching people with developmental disabilities. There, she received her first communication device, an alphabet board with letters that Jodak King could point to for the person she was speaking with to sound out. In a 1972 interview with the Seattle Times, she spelled out ICALLITMYMOUTH. I call it my mouth, to describe her board. Communication devices opened the world for her, Jodak King said on a 2012 panel about disability rights. Her doctor, she added, was surprised that she could think. She took art classes at the college and learned to paint using a brush that attached to her arm. Over several decades, she created art through paintings, poetry, and theater, and was a founding member of Artists Unlimited, an arts organization for people with disabilities that began in the early 1980s and served hundreds of artists and exhibitions. She met her husband, Alan King, at United Cerebral Palsy, now known as Provail, and the two married in 1983. King, who died in 2021, used his foot to communicate. The couple moved to a house near Green Lake, adopted a cat named Fred, and lived independently with help from caregivers and aides. Longtime friend Bill Reeves, who met Jodak King in 1985, worked as their live-in attendant, and would go with Jodak King as she served on myriad boards, councils, and organizations. Reeves's favorite memories with Jodak King are visiting schools throughout the region so students could meet someone with a disability. Elementary students would swarm her once class was dismissed, touching her head and her hands to feel the vibration of her thoughts moving from her mind to her hands. They oohed and awed over her wheelchair and communication device. The kids were fascinated by her, and King loved it. She would have this look on her face where she was seeing the faces of our future, and she was in her element, Reeves said. That's who she was, a teacher. Around the Seattle area, she worked with a group to add wheelchair lifts to metro buses, pushed for curb cuts on city streets, and would go to hotels to ensure they were compliant with requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990. I've heard that some professional people don't think that people with disabilities can make choices about their serious health problems, and the final decision should be left up to the professional people, she once said. Folks, I ask you, who knows your body better than you? It's up to you or the people you know and trust who should talk up and make the people who take care of your needs, your wishes, whatever they are. I ask you again, who knows you the best? King traveled to Washington, D.C. for conventions and to talk about disability policy. She once met Hillary Clinton, and during one visit, she noticed that vehicles for wheelchair users didn't use tie-down systems to keep the rider safe, said Robin Sanford, a speech pathologist who traveled with her on the trip and had first met King at Provale. She and Sanford spent the rest of the trip showing each other how to use the tie-downs. He was very spunky and very outspoken and giving direction, Sanford said. Both she and Alan taught me everyone should have a voice to communicate. Years ago, King took an acting class where each student wrote their own skit. Hers was about wanting to be able to fly, recalled Christine Coble, who first met King at Rainier School. Coble vividly remembers watching her friend perform. It said to me how much she wished to move in ways she couldn't, she said. It was really quite moving. During the skit, King went up a ramp, then stopped at the top where two women lifted her up. In that moment, she could fly. The obituary of Sharon Jodak King, who died this year of COVID-19. Okay, I'd like to turn to the conversation for today. Really excited to bring Kate STARBIRD back to COVID Calls. Let me introduce her to you. Kate STARBIRD is Associate Professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Her research is situated within human-computer interaction and the emerging field of crisis informatics, the study of how social media and other information communication technologies are used during crisis events. Currently, her work focuses on the production and spread of online rumors, misinformation, and disinformation in the context of crisis events. STARBIRD is a co-founder of the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, and she's been extremely generous to COVID Calls, and it is great to have you back, Kate. Good to see you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on again. And what an amazing life story that was. That was really powerful.
I really like the part about how she would make time to go into hotels. like a one-woman enforcement crew. That's amazing.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, the whole thing was fantastic.
So it's good to see you again, and you're calling from, let me get a quick update if I can, just where you're calling from and how it's looking there in the pandemic.
This is state of Washington. I'm at University of Washington. I'm on campus today. It is quiet on campus. Our students are back in classes, but staff and faculty have not really, well, we came back in the fall, and then kind of because of Omicron, we went back sort of hybrid in the winter. We're getting excited. I think we're going to go back in person in the spring, but the state of Washington has been fairly conservative, and I think in terms of how we've managed COVID, and conservative being like, listening to public health officials in this case, and so we've had, some ways limited, lower death rates than a lot of other places, and have felt like we've survived a lot of that. In some ways, come through in some ways better off than some other states, but we have also been much more, resistant to being out and about. And I think we are kind of looking forward to what maybe comes next, but still really nervous and a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. I've traveled to Florida and I've been like, oh my God, my feet, I just landed in a whole different world. Like there's no masks, people aren't using. And then you come back to Washington State, everyone's wearing masks even outside still, and still kind of thinking through what comes next. So still a lot of uncertainty, but kind of thinking about expecting my window not to be an empty, empty fields and pathways in a few weeks when we come back from our spring break.
That cognitive dissonance is we're sort of back in some ways to the way things were in the first months of 2020. I think I was talking with journalist Deborah Amos the other day. She was talking about traveling from Germany to London, from Berlin to London. And Berlin still has pretty tight controls. People are masking, she described. And then she got to London. It was like, no pandemic here.
Yeah.
Short flight, different experience.
No, I think it's a really interesting, and we'll look back at it in different ways. And what's really hard is to know that, like, we can look at the statistics and say, this area was much more effective by COVID. We had higher hospitalizations or lower, or whatever. And yet I think, the way that the history gets written about this may not reflect those realities as much as this perception that, this rhetoric around public health measures being somehow oppressive seems to be winning the day. And I think that's one of it's going to be a bad taste in our mouths going forward. Say the Washington, my parents sometimes reflect that back to me because some of the media they look at, and I was like, you're alive. None of your friends have died. Yes, we weren't able to see you sometimes because your facility kind of wouldn't let visitors happen, but you've made it through, and you haven't lost any of your friends. And so, and that's not true of other places. And I think that's it's hard. It's hard to come to this reckoning that the truth of the matter is so relative.
Well, trying to find out who's communicating the truth of the matter is really right at the heart of what you spend a lot of your time doing, I think. I wanted to just bring up, since we're talking about some of the statistics and how this is going to be reported. We talked last on February 12th, 2021. I cannot believe it's been that long in COVID time. It's 10 years. At that time, 479,842 deaths reported in the United States from COVID. And South Korea, where I am, 1,507. So it's a little bit more than a year ago. I don't know how much store you put by those numbers, but I was curious, even just this last year of the pandemic experience, what's it been like for you? Do you have a strong memory from this last year of it?
A strong memory. I was talking to we have no memories. Everything seems to be bleeding together because our lives have become those of us that have not returned to normal for whatever reason. Things kind of blend together. I was talking to my nephew, he's 13, and we can hang out with him again. His whole family's had Omicron, so I was like, come over after they were better. And we were talking, and he was talking about, we went here last summer, and I was like, that was 3 summers ago. And when you were 11 years, you're 11 years old, you're gonna be 14 this coming summer. And he's like, those summers don't count. Like they're gone. Like nothing happened. It was a really interesting from a 13-year-old to reflect on like the loss of memories. And that's not to say that like we did some fun things and his family did some fun things along the way, but it's been a long 2 years, and yet many people have sort of fast forwarded from 2 years ago to today in some of the ways that our memories seem to be making sense of what's happened.
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, it's hard enough when you're, almost 50 like I am, to lose a couple of summers is tragic, but those summers when you're 12 and 13, even though I don't think I did very much, but those were important. That was important time to do nothing.
Yeah. I mean, and they may look back. I mean, they spent a lot more time with their family. They did go on some family like trips and in terms of like more camping, those kinds of things. But as a 13-year-old, I think they're really interested in like the social elements of life. And, you know, we were talking about, we had taken him to Santa Fe and we had all these nice experiences when he was 11. And those are the kinds of things that he's missed out on, you know, and he really values the social contact. And I think, you know, the kids that age really are reflecting on that. He's doing great. He's back in school. He's got a girlfriend. I don't know what that means at 13, but he's definitely, you know, he's doing fine. But I think, you know, they felt the impact.
I want to turn to your research, and I'm going to start, actually, if it's okay, with some things that are just, we're all trying to follow the news right now, and then we'll work backwards into some of the things you were covering earlier in the pandemic. So there's a war in Ukraine in the middle of a pandemic. And so you study disinformation, misinformation, and conspiracy, and how it gets propagated in social media and other media. So I guess I have a general question to start. What are you seeing in terms of the kinds of trends that you track? What are you seeing right now in Ukraine? And I'm also curious how that connects with other wars that you have studied, for example, Syria.
Yeah. It's such a hard question. It's so hard as a researcher. You know, we're collecting data all the time, and we're trying to create these data collections, and then something happens in a part of the world, and with a crisis event or something else, and we want to help, and we have, you know, some skill sets that might be able to contribute to an understanding of that. With the invasion of Ukraine, I think we've both been, like, first of all, just overwhelmed by what's happening there, wanting to be able to contribute in a positive way, especially with our skill sets, sort of like unpacking Russian disinformation campaigns and those kinds of things. And yet, you know, not wanting to damage the situation. And so being really careful about, you know, how do we communicate in a way that A, isn't trying to get attention for ourselves, and B, is in a productive way that can't be used in a counterproductive way. And I'm more and more tuned into the active measures kind of philosophy, that active measures aren't just like the first attack, but they also kind of, they leverage your reaction to that attack, and that makes things worse. So really kind of thinking about, if we're going to take any action here and understand what's going on and help other people understand, is that going to be beneficial, and how's that going to be beneficial? So thinking through all of that. And so we've just started to talk about some of the analyses we're doing. We're really just trying to understand the information ecosystem in that space. We are seeing a lot of similarities in the actors and the narratives that were spreading around the conflict in Syria. Particularly, we studied the campaign, the disinformation campaign that targeted the White Helmets. They were a humanitarian response organization working in areas of Syria that were not held by the government, so rebel-held areas of Syria that were trying to respond, do recovery, first aid, and rescue of people that were affected by the bombing campaigns there that were perpetrated by the Syrian government and their Russian allies. And there was a whole disinformation campaign that was meant to sort of question whether or not that was even happening. And they were recording, the White Helmets would record these incidents where the bombs had affected civilian populations. And there was a very effective disinformation campaign that was connected to the Russian state media apparatus. And we see the same websites and some of the same narratives and the same tactics being used around Ukraine to try to muddy the waters and undermine the evidence that's coming out of war crimes during that Russian invasion there.
Just to stay with that for a minute, when you find that when you're able to actually track through maybe a similar kind of disinformation campaign, and you trace it back to some of the same agents as before, what's your next step? And you were indicating this a minute ago about trying to be careful in how you intervene, but is there, I mean, in your lab, I mean, do you have a code of best practices on the wall, like when you intervene and when you don't? It seems like it's a very gray area to me.
Every event is different. And when we were studying the Syrian conflict, it was a little after the disinformation campaign started, and there wasn't a lot of attention anymore to the conflict. And so we found ourselves putting content out there, and the only people paying attention were the people perpetrating the campaigns, who would then sort of dogpile us. the information space feels different with Ukraine right now. So many people around the world, their eyes are on Ukraine. And so in this sense, like, the questions that we have around publishing are like, are we giving outsized attention to these actors? Are we actually going to drive more people to their websites if we say who they are? Are we, are they going to take back our network graph to their funders and say, look, we're making a real impact here, please fund us more, or whatever. So we're trying to think about, like, how do we help people understand things without amplifying the narratives that are so problematic and that we see are tied to this disinformation campaign.
So, once the war started in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how did social media companies based in the United States or elsewhere, how did they react? I mean, I remember particularly in the first 24, 48 hours, people were speculating that Twitter, for example, was going to go crazy with disinformation. But then, and maybe you can explain Twitter itself, the company's actions to try to limit disinformation. And people I've heard people say, actually, it's a lot nicer on Twitter now since the war started because I get less pandemic disinformation than before. But I wanted to talk to you about that because I don't know if any of that actually bears out with evidence.
Yeah, I don't know if I can make strongly evidenced claims right now about how the actions of the companies are impacting things. I can say that the companies are taking action. They're adding new labels for state-sponsored media, suspending accounts from some state-sponsored media, probably paying more attention when sets of like botnet accounts are or sort of AstroTurf's accounts are spreading those kinds of things. Certainly, there's a difference right now in the information space than the one that we saw with the same narratives and the same actors around Syria. And there's all sorts of reasons why that could happen. I think, and even Ukraine in 2014, right? We were studying that conflict, but we were studying the downing of MH17 when I was our team back in around that time when we were studying sort of rumors and crisis events, and those narratives bounced around a lot more among people who were like, shouldn't you have known better? Well, they didn't, and now I think a lot of more people do. And so there seems to be more resilience in the system in some audiences, and certainly the platforms have new policies and new infrastructure and labels and kinds of things to try to address some of these problems. That being said, they are moving kind of quickly. You can see that they aren't executing a plan or a policy. In some cases, they're making decisions and then retroactively trying to say why they've made those decisions. And so there has been some good criticism that they're moving in such a way that it's going to be difficult to defend these policies in the future, where there's a conflict that has different sets of actors. And so it's interesting to see. It's going to be a mess, and I think they're under a lot of stress at those companies trying to figure out what to do and how to best do it in a way that recognizes what's happening and who the perpetrators of the violence are right now, and at the same time recognizes that policies that they make right now may be used in different conflicts in different ways or cited as in different conflicts in different ways. And so I don't envy their position at all.
What's your philosophy about Ukrainian disinformation? I assume there's some out there, versus Russian disinformation. You want to research all of it, expose all of it, trace all of it, or because this kind of research puts you I struggle with this as a disaster researcher too. You find yourself in a position and taking a position. Sometimes the research backs you into that position, and then you're like, oh, I had already decided this without realizing I had decided it.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and it speaks to like value sets and why we do research, and every set of questions is in some ways political because you're making a decision of what to study and what not to study. I can say that the network graph I put out today is objective, and in fact I just put a network graph out. Here's the search term I used. I searched for the biolab search term, and out comes a network graph. But I didn't search for the Snake Island search term. and run the network graph on that, which turned out to be, a slightly bent narrative as well. So there are choices that we make every day, and I think it also speaks to, like, I was at years ago. I was at this. I was in an embassy. I can't remember which one, and it's probably good because we don't want to. It was a Nordic country, and they were talking about what the difference between propaganda and disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying, propaganda can be all sorts of things. And they said, look around this room. There's this whole photography exhibit with pictures of men with their young children on paternity leave. And they said, this is propaganda. We are really proud of our paternity leave policies and the fact that we're encourage men to take paternity leave, and that, this is part of what we think parenting is in our country. And you might consider this propaganda. We might consider this propaganda, but this is not it. We don't think it's bad. Some propaganda can support a set of values. Disinformation, on the other hand, is something that's actually meant to just jam your system so you can't understand what's going on, to muddy the waters. And if we look at a conflict like, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's some pretty clear things that have happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And they can question the history and all these things, and they come up with, what they usually do is come up with 17 different narratives. They don't even all go together, but they're just trying to muddy the facts of that situation. Our lab studies disinformation as a tactic. Other countries use disinformation in different ways. We've seen participatory disinformation in the context of the US election. We've seen disinformation around COVID used to mobilize political action and sell nutritional supplements. And so we do look at that, and we can imagine that there is some disinformation that is being spread from the Ukrainian side. But there's an asymmetry there around the spread of disinformation. And I think it's important to not get so back on our heels of like, oh, we've studied this disinformation campaign, we have to give equal weight to that one. Well, no, if the problem is a particular tactic used to great effect by a particular belligerent in a conflict, I think it's there's a value choice, and I'll stand behind that, to say we're thinking about protecting democracy and sovereignty and human rights, and the work that we're doing is going to do that.
Thank you for being so clear about that. It's interesting too to think. I mean, in some ways, I guess propaganda, when it's effective, it simplifies. And disinformation, the way you're describing, when it's effective, it complicates it. You said it jams up the system.
It jams the system. It's just noise. It's there to destabilize you so much so you don't know that you not only don't know the truth, but you don't even think that the truth is knowable anymore. And it can demotivate. What we saw with the disinformation on the Syrian conflict was it demotivated what should have been a global response to horrifying crimes that were happening in Syria. And it demotivated that response by confusing people enough that they weren't quite sure it was true. They weren't quite sure who was right and who was wrong. Is that really happening? Are those crisis actors, or is that really, a dead body of a child who's right, suffering from a chemical weapons attack? And there was and you might not totally believe the false narratives, but they seeded enough doubt that people didn't feel confident going to our political leaders and saying, do something about this. And that's it's not just propaganda. It's got a different flavor to it. And it supports, these kinds of like authoritarian leadership and sort of one-sided bullying action where people can just deny that they're doing it. It's like gaslighting at this global level.
Let me just take a moment to remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Kate STARBIRD today. I went back and looked right around the time that the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, and I found what I thought I would find, which is you gave a lot of interviews. You're really good at making time, and one of them caught my eye because you gave concrete steps that people should think about to protect against disinformation as the war was getting started. And one of the points you made in this interview was, you said people should correct mistakes. I'm just going to quote here from this. Don't just delete them, you said. Also correct others online. If it's someone you care about, contact them via direct message or other quiet method. For others, public correction can alert their followers. I love that advice. And at the same time, 2 years into COVID, it's like, wow, this
We're
is
still
what we
there.
do now.
Yeah, I'm gonna correct you here.
Good.
I turned down almost every media request initially because I didn't know what to say, and
Really?
I didn't want to seek attention, and I thought, I'm not sure. We're waiting to see how this turns out, and I don't know what, how we can help. And actually, what I did is one night I just tweeted a thread of these are the things I know I can say. So I have control over the fact that I'm not going to get ask a question and have to answer it. I actually have control. And so I thought that might be a better way to communicate. And actually the tweet thread got picked up by the news. So then I was like, just go to the tweet thread. If you want to use it, go right ahead. And
this journalist indicated they had spoken to you, but I guess what they did, spoke to you and you said, go to the tweet.
Yeah, and then I might have spoke to a couple of folks to go further. I think I did 2 or 3 interviews. So after I did that thread, I might have spoken to a few folks to kind of to clarify. But the core of the statement was really about like, I just really wanted to stay in my lane of like, here's some pointers for how to approach social media right now without kind of positioning myself as an expert in this conflict that just was, and still is kind of beyond some of our expertise, except where it maps on to the Syrian conflict, which we know very well through years of study of that.
And that advice to correct mistakes, how much of your confidence in that statement comes from what you've now seen studying 2 years of COVID misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy?
I think a lot of it is just congealing around a few kind of recommendations that are both about, first we want to acknowledge like it's actually not the consumer's fault. It's actually the environment makes it really difficult for us to make sense of things, and that corrections at their very best are actually helping others navigate this environment. And that when we do correct, we should do it with empathy, because from what I've seen from COVID, it's like everybody makes mistakes. Everybody shares things that turn out not to be true at some point. I think a lot of us are getting better at not doing that. There's certain times where we're most vulnerable to sharing misinformation. And that's, when we're sort of politically, in our political identities, or when we're, angry or emotionally activated. And so we have kind of begun to see a set of like best practices emerge, not just in our group, but around the folks that are doing this kind of research. And so absolutely that comes not just from COVID, but also things before, but certainly the last few years is just, even though it seems like an uphill battle, and it's not clear that the truth won out in the end of the day, but I think there are some good practices where individually, even if people have made mistakes, even if they have misperceptions about COVID or the election in 2020, I think as on the whole, we're better prepared for what comes next, because I think people are getting a little bit savvier about understanding where we're most vulnerable to spreading false narratives.
What do you feel comfortable saying now with 2 years of pandemic research behind you and your team about the way that misinformation around COVID becomes a platform for actual political organizing, fundraising? I mean, I think a lot of us, I wasn't too surprised that Trump misbehaved badly. I have been surprised at various moments that it seemed like mainstream GOP has picked up misinformation and send out fundraising appeals based on that. I don't know why that surprised me, but it has.
Yeah, one of the real interesting things that we've seen is in the COVID context, in the election, in the false claims of election fraud as well, is the mobilization on top of these falsehoods. And the extreme example is the mobilization that leads to January 6th, right? But there's anti-mask protests, there are anti-vaccine protests, there's the convoy, there's like this building of grievance that has misinformation wrapped into that grievance, and is used to mobilize people to take political action. And that is, for a populist leader, that it can be a ticket to your election. And I think that a lot of political folks, especially on the right now, this new right, have recognized that as potentially integral to the power that they have. And we've been talking about it as participatory disinformation with these cycles of like you use misinformation, with actual grievance, you have to find an actual problem. With participatory disinformation, you can just invent a problem, get people really angry about it, and then use that anger to mobilize things that advance your political careers in one way or another. And so, unfortunately, I think there are some people that recognize that pervasive disinformation actually erodes the foundation of democracy. When we can't come together in a shared reality, we can't make the decisions that we need to make to lead a country. Unfortunately, there are folks for whom having a functioning democracy isn't as important as power, and they realize that spreading disinformation is the key to their power. And so, until we find people who can also kind of begin to shape, in particular, the Republican Party right now, we can see a little bit that's happening on the edges of the Democratic Party, but in particular, this is happening in the center of the Republican Party. If they think that their power is more important than the outcomes of spreading pervasive disinformation, we might be in for a long and bumpy ride as a democracy.
I mean, the thing that gives me pause is that some of this disinformation, I mean, we're going to head into the midterm election, and then the general election is going to start. I already see the rewriting of the narrative around COVID, and you and I were chatting a bit before we started just about talking about whether or not certain like non-pharmaceutical inventions actually mattered in terms of infection rates. And I mean, I already hear, politicians dismissing, saying things like, well, masks haven't saved any lives. It was the vaccine, and you should be able to, like, they just brush past that. But you notice it builds momentum. And I don't know how you truth squad something like that once it becomes, I mean, people have talked about the term the big lie a lot. There's multiple ones.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the reasons I was a little nervous about coming on having this conversation. Is like I'm almost more from a misinformation researcher's perspective. It's almost more depressing at this moment. All of the worst things happen. 1 million Americans will have died by the end of the next few months or whatever it is. Unfortunately, it's horrifying, and yet we're going to define it as like the problem was our public health response. When our public health response, the problem was we didn't respond enough. If we look around, we did worse than almost any other country, and it's horrifying that people are still dying because they're choosing not to take vaccines, and the fact that is still a part of what our situation is, and may continue to be if we have different variants of COVID reappear and people still refuse vaccines as time goes on, and still retroactively pretend like that's not real, or that I don't know. It's a little depressing.
I wonder too how there's a sort of a scale problem that I don't fully understand. I mean, it's one thing when the President of the United States or people who have a large social media platform, a huge one, retweet disinformation. I mean, Donald Trump retweeted, I was just looking to see the new Surgeon General of Florida, Joseph Ladapo. I think Trump retweeted something he had said early on about, hydroxy and various things. I mean, so that's a big platform. Well, Trump's not on that platform anymore. But I see that America's frontline doctors are still active. They're still selling ivermectin. And I guess my question is, in terms of priority setting, so this is like maybe a question about how we turn your research into interventions and policies. One would think, I guess the easiest way to go is just to find who has the largest platform and try to, give disclaimers or deplatform them, which Twitter has done with Trump. But that doesn't seem to actually be where the action is. The action seems to be with a lot of actors who are operating at a smaller scale or a middle scale.
I'm not sure that it's just one or the other. With the voter fraud misinformation, which I know a little bit better, but I think it was very similar in the COVID-19, is like the vast majority of misleading content on Twitter, where we study it, but we can see that as a proxy for other places as well. like 50% all derived, 50% of all the content derived from 150 accounts. So it was the retweets of 150 accounts that were 50% of the content that was like kind of pushing the false voter fraud claims. Those are kind of estimates. There's some noisiness in the data, but that doesn't mean that. So you take them out. There's still a lot spreading, but that would get rid of a large amount of it. Unfortunately, only about 10% of those accounts are gone. And some of the worst offenders and the most visible ones were removed. But if an account was verified and was large, even if they spread many of those false narratives, if they did it in a certain way with their little just asking questions, I'm just pointing this out, maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, and they get around some of the rules, and they're still there today. I mean, Donald Trump's 2 adult sons, I think, are still on Twitter, and they were over and over again, they appear in our data pushing false voter fraud claims. And that doesn't even go into the misinformation about COVID that they and others have spread. So yeah, I think there's more room for thinking about better policies and policies that are more evenly spread on verified accounts as well as unverified accounts. I think Twitter actually did a great job of taking out a lot of the unverified accounts that were influential in spreading misleading content about voter fraud, but they did not take out the verified accounts of similar follower size, which is interesting. And similar kinds of things I think were happening on Facebook. We could still see some of the worst actors are still there. But again, even if you take those out, like everyday people will find a way to get back in there. But I think the more friction you add to the system, we could begin to see some turning of the tide.
Let me just a quick reminder to folks that you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Kate STARBIRD today. So you may not want to say, but I'll ask you anyway. Have you gone into Truth Social?
They don't need any more users. I don't even think I'm not convinced that project is going to be successful. But I have not. No, I have colleagues who have. Well, they tried to sign up for an account, and it took so long that I think they lost interest. But
okay.
Yeah.
I guess that was the larger question to that is what happens in the media atmosphere when platforms like Twitter and Facebook, which you can pull a lot of data from and do the kind of studies that you do, if it bifurcates or if it becomes diffuse and you have sort of entrepreneurs like Trump who says, yeah, I'll just have my own misinformation social media channel.
Yeah, it breaks up into fragments, and there's some interesting theories about that. I think there's a good and a bad to breaking up in that way. You've got, when people move away from the larger platforms where they might get more diversity of views, they can get even more siloed in echo chambers, and it's possible that they could become even more extreme or radicalized in those spaces. And so there is a danger in that kind of like pushing people off the mainstream platforms into these smaller platforms. At the same time, in those new spaces, they can't recruit as well. And so their numbers it's hard to make the numbers grow. And they also get bored because they can't yell at other people and they can't have the kind of conflict. Those aren't conflict spaces anymore. And if they thrive on conflict, that's not a very enjoyable place to be. It's all about, people boosting each other. And so it's not clear that the incentives are the same for participating in those spaces. So my sense is that yes, they may become more radical in those spaces, but they also may shrink. And the net gain of not letting them, recruit more people into these sort of like either extreme ideologies or like alternate versions of reality, may be worth the risk of having them be a little bit siloed. But others may disagree with that. I think there's still some research to be done on those, on what it means to have things sort of spread out that way. But certainly it becomes less visible, and that is less visible to research, which will be a challenge. Makes my job harder, but I think it makes the world better. So I'm happy for that.
I wanted to we're wrapping up here in a second. I just wanted to share a personal anecdote with you. My brother texted me not long ago. He was visiting with a close member of the family who is anti-vaccine, has been swayed by that, and was not vaccinated and got COVID and survived after a really rough run of it. And his communication with me was, I'm having the conversation with this member of the family who doesn't understand the business model of Facebook. And my brother broke down for me a discussion he had with this family member who believed that Facebook was just a place where, well, what it appears to be. People just, put up information and other people grab that, and it's just a place where like-minded people share information. And this person's response to my brother when hearing the business model said, yeah, but I don't buy anything from Facebook.
Doesn't matter.
And so this is a person who's been hurt in this pandemic by misinformation, found a community of like-minded consumers of misinformation, refused the vaccine, and we find out that this person just didn't know that they were a victim. And like you, I have a lot of empathy for the consumer. This person's also a person I love, it's very close in my family. It made me think that I just want to share that with you, but also that we need information literacy in this country in a big way, like time now. And I don't know if that's something you're advising on or working on, but I hope you are.
Yeah, no, I think we're beginning to think more about like civic media literacy. We need not just the tactics, and we need to understand the systems. We need to understand the tactics for like vetting information that we see, and we need to understand why it's important. Because we can teach people how to figure out what and whom to trust, but they usually don't use those tactics when they like the information. So you're less likely to be skeptical of things that you like, that resonate with the things you already believe. And so we've got to not just teach people how, but also teach them why. And I also think there's a big role that the platforms could play, because they're facilitating so much of this access to information, but there's no scaffolding for people to make sense of this information in these spaces, and there's no way for them to find the context they need. And so I really think there needs to be some synergy between platform design and this new civic media literacy, like what we're learning there, to where we actually scaffold the platforms with the signals people need to help them make better decisions about what and whom to trust.
That would be great. And before you can open your Facebook account, if there was a required training of some sort, I don't know how we're going to do it, but it's really, I guess 13-year-olds across America could probably lead the training. They seem to be very savvy.
If we can keep the world long, I don't think the kids are the problem. I mean, there's always going to be tension there, but the kids are going to be much savvier. This is a K through 99 problem, and it's really like we keep the world around long enough so that our media literacy classes in the high schools will pay off. But between now and then, we've got to train the rest of us who aren't in school. And how do we give ourselves the skills to be participants in these online media spaces?
Hey, you were named one of Seattle's 10 most influential thinkers by Seattle Met magazine. That's cool. Congratulations.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. It was
great photograph and a really nice write-up. I thought it was a really concise and kind of beautiful write-up of your research and your impact.
It was excellent. I actually wrote back to the journalist. It was like one of the best pieces that I've seen. I usually, you usually read something, you're like, oh, that's not really how I would have said. And then I just thought they did such a good job.
Yeah. Well, I just want to remind folks you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls live at 7 p.m. Eastern time, although these days we have COVID Calls coming pretty much around the clock as we lead up to the 500th episode, which will be March 16th. Great to get to talk to you again, Kate, and appreciate you coming back now for the third time. We have these 3 calls, which really mark out kind of interesting mileposts in this experience we've been living through. I value your research so much, and just thanks again for making the time.
Yeah, thank you again for having me on. This is a great conversation. I always enjoy it.
Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time on COVID.